Convening the Estates General. In May of 1789, His Highness King Louis XVI convened the Estates General. Now, this assembly was convened. They were brought together at Versailles, where the royal palace was. Now, the meeting began with a mass, a Catholic church service, after which the delegates of the estates entered the hall in a procession led by the First Estate. And that's when they go into the hall where the meeting was taking place. So, this revolution begins on... People don't really realize this is a revolution at the time. This begins rather calm as a government meeting about taxes. Begins with so basically the clergy come in, they celebrate the church service, bless the delegates, and then the clergy, who are the First Estate, they enter the hall, followed by the delegates of the Second Estate, and finally with the delegates of the Third Estate coming in behind them. And that's how this whole process begins. So now, we're going to be looking at some of the personalities and some of the goals involved. We're going to start with His Highness himself, Louis XVI. Now, Louis XVI was, by all accounts, actually a pretty amicable dude. He was a pretty chill dude. People liked him. Personally, he was very personable. His biggest problem was his intellect. He was just terrible at politics and statecraft. This was not a man who was a natural leader. His expertise was actually more in vocational skills, in working with his hands. In fact, he was an incredibly talented locksmith, by all accounts. He made several of his own locks. He was a master locksmith, but not a particularly great head of state. Not everyone is cut out for politics. Not everyone wants to be in charge. Not everyone is good at being in charge. Now, Louis felt it was his duty to be in charge. He couldn't just step down from the throne. He felt he had to do what was best for his subjects. The problem was he just was not particularly good at it. He tried desperately to reform, but he had very limited follow-through on his reforms, and he had a sincere desire to be loved by the people. He wanted to reform. He wanted to make France better. He just wasn't really so great at doing it. It's kind of a tragic story. Now, he married Marie Antoinette, who was a Habsburg princess, the daughter of Maria Theresa, the queen who fought in the War of the Austrian Succession. Now, the marriage between Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI joined the Habsburgs and the Bourbons in an alliance that made them an incredibly powerful unit. However, the alliance almost fell apart because of Louis's inability to produce heir. He suffered from several reproductive health issues, mostly due to an unfortunate medical condition relating to His Highness's foreskin, which was too tight around that particular organ, leading to an unfortunately painful experience that had to be remedied by way of a surgery, which was done without anesthesia, which, as you might imagine, would be an incredibly painful prospect to have penis surgery with no way of numbing it. Nonetheless, the king did it, and he had several heirs thereafter. So that was Louis XVI. So, now that we know what the king's just trying to reform, he knows he needs to raise taxes, so that's why he calls the Estates General. But why do the estates come? What do they want to do? So the aims of the First Estate, what are the clergy up to? Well, it really varies from cleric to cleric. Now, there tends to be a desire by many to maintain the historic rights and liberties of the Church. As the official religion of France, the Catholic Church enjoyed several historic rights and privileges, which included not only being the official religion of France, but that there was no tax placed on church lands. So that meant church buildings, the farms and wineries and distilleries that were owned by the church were not taxable. The government could not levy taxes on them. Now, they also ran several schools. The Christian Brothers, which was one religious order, founded several schools for the poor within France. Several universities had been founded by the Jesuits and by other church orders and other church leaders, such as the University of Paris. And these were all under church control, and they wanted to keep it that way. Now, some actually sided with the Third Estate. One is Abbé Sieyès. And we'll be talking about Sieyès in a bit, and what I'm going to give you a look at some of his quotes from his famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? So, as we move forward, now let's look at what did the Second Estate want. So first of all, the nobles, the Second Estate, they want to minimize the taxes they're going to have to pay, because they know the whole purpose of the king convening the estates is to try to get their taxes raised. And they want to minimize that as much as possible. But there's a reason they consent to having the estates called. There's a reason they actually kind of want this. It's because they want to establish a parliament. So over in Britain, the nobles in the House of Lords and their cousins and second brothers who made up the gentry, who lacked formal noble titles but were pretty much nobility adjacent, they really ruled the roost over in Britain. The king had a batty George III, and George III suffered from many mental issues. George III's mental health was about as terrible as Louis XVI's reproductive. It was a suffering time. But at any rate, George III, for all the talk about George III did this, and George III did that, and George III did some other dang thing that you hear in the Declaration of Independence, George III really wasn't doing a whole lot. It was Parliament that was the real power in Britain. And the French understood that. And the French nobles looked at the British Parliament and said, we want France to be like that. We want a France with a constitutional monarchy where we are the real power in the government, not the king. So, what about the Third Estate? What does the Third Estate want to do? Well, the Third Estate wants to gain more political power and recognition. Right now, they're paying the major share of the taxes, and they don't have a lot of political power. So they want to decrease their own taxes, and they want to increase the taxes and reduce the privileges of the nobility and the church. That's the major goals of the Third Estate coming into the States in general. So you see right now how instantly their goals are now going to be walking a little bit the other two. They're trying to increase their own power and decrease their own taxes at the expense of the nobility and the clergy. On top of it, they're trying to limit the historic powers of the nobility and the clergy, which are something that the nobility and the clergy are very interested in protecting at this point. So this really is a recipe for conflict. We're going to get into how that conflict ignites beginning around the June of 1789. We're going to get there in our next lecture. Thank you.